Over the last couple weeks, I've been counting down my favorite horror games from generation to generation, and now I'm back to talk about the 5th generation of consoles, the N64, the PlayStation 1, and the Sega Saturn. And honestly, this has been the toughest list to put together because there are so many great horror games, or at least memorable horror games, from the 5th generation of systems, especially with the kind of rise of the survival horror genre. But without further ado, let's start counting down my favorite, the 10 best horror games from the 5th generation of systems. The same rules apply as all the other lists, only one game per franchise makes the list. One of the first PlayStation 1 games I owned when I got my system, MIDI Evil, has you playing as the unlikely hero of Sir Dan, who's resurrected 100 years after his death as an evil wizard is trying to resurrect people and steal their souls. It is pretty typical 3D action of the generation itself, with those same kind of quirks and issues that a lot of early 3D games had, but it was the set pieces and the overall enjoyable action, and then of course some humor thrown in, that made MIDI Evil always stand out and is why it's one of my favorite horror games. With the popularity of Resident Evil, Capcom decided to make another horror franchise in Dino Crisis. Here you get to play as Regina, a very much forgotten heroine of video games, but you get to blast your way from dino to dino while you're exploring Ibis Island trying to stop a secret weapon project. While the game has a lot of action, some great intense moments, I feel like it still kind of slows down a bit, especially as you make it a little bit farther in. While it may not be the best of the survival horror genre of this generation, Dino Crisis is still very fondly remembered as far as I'm concerned. While it may not be the best playing game on this list, Shadow Man is one I always finally remember. Based on the comics, as you play as Michael, the Shadow Man, who's haunted by the death of his brother from years past. He has voodoo-like powers that he gets to use, and plenty of gothic and dark locations for you to travel to. It does have those issues of early 3D games, for sure, but the overall plot and the atmosphere of Shadow Man was one of the reasons I kept playing it. One of the best examples of a hidden gem on this list, Codelco, which actually was the precursor to the Shadowheart series that would come on the next generation of systems. You play as the gypsy Codelco. It's set in the late 1800s and has much more of a horror atmosphere than almost any RPG I had played, especially up to that point. It has a bit of a different battle system with a more kind of tactical grid-based battle system as you move your characters along, which can be a bit slow at times, but overall, if you're able to get a hold of it, Codelco is one horror RPG experience that is worth having. While we didn't receive the original here, Clocktower 2 came to North America as just Clocktower. It was now a 3D game with a point-and-click interface still, as you're still trying to escape the immortal Scissorman. What made the game so great, though, was not only the atmosphere and the horror elements, but just so much that could change the plot of the game, as well as the game's various endings. This is a game that screamed replayability, and is definitely one of my favorites on the system. Game developer Kenji Eno was way ahead of his time in many regards to his creations, including D, Enemy Zero, and of course D2. The original D, though, is the one that makes this list, as you play as Laura Harris trying to figure out why your father, a famous doctor, went insane. It's all point-and-click and puzzle-based and a relatively short experience. This is basically kind of an interactive movie. But all the atmosphere and just everything that D was able to accomplish in it led to an absolutely creepy and a very fun horror experience for the 5th generation. A game series that I love that I don't get to talk about very often is the Deception series, and in particular for this list, the one I played first. While it may not be the best of the series, it's the one that I most fondly remember, and that is Tecmos Deception. It's a game where you play as the head of a castle, and your goal is to keep the villagers out of the castle, and you do so by setting up traps and killing them. And there's all kinds of crazy strategies and tons of traps for you to set up in order to defend your castle. It is a very dark game, but just so unique for its time that Tecmos Deception brought me in, and I played it for hours upon hours. While it may not be my personal favorite in the series, Castlevania Symphony of the Night is undeniably an iconic piece of gaming history and a great horror game. It has some awesome set pieces, some killer music, and I love a large portion of not only the enemies, but just the overall action gameplay and some fantastic boss encounters throughout the course of it. It changed Castlevania forever, which I still begrudgingly have a little bit of an issue with because I love the classic Castlevania, but Symphony of the Night is still a masterpiece to this day. When I decided to do this list, there was no issue coming up with number 1 and 2, but what order they went in, that was the difficult spot. So I decided to go with Silent Hill, the original, here for number 2 on this countdown. You play as Harry, who's trying to figure out what happened to his girl Cheryl in the haunted town of Silent Hill. The whole occult feel and just the dark atmosphere with some really creepy monsters and even bosses throughout makes Silent Hill still stand up today as a great horror experience. While not my favorite of the entire series, Silent Hill 1 was definitely a fantastic horror game and one of the best from the 5th gen. Before we get to number 1 though, let's look at a couple of honorable mentions, and honestly, I could have filled up a whole nother list, or even 2 more lists with horror games from the 5th gen. Nightmare Creatures is one though I do like to talk about just because it's one that I don't think gets looked at all that often. It is a bit difficult and it takes a bit to get used to the action as it's much more action oriented. I love the whole set pieces as well as the monster design that you got to fight. It was a tough game to try to get through, and I feel like many that maybe gave it a try never got past maybe the first or even second area of the game. But Nightmare Creatures, whether the N64 or the PS1 version, is one that I can recommend checking out to horror action fans. I know a lot of people that see this list are going to say, why wasn't this in the main top 10? But Parasite Eve and Parasite Eve 2 are both fun horror experiences, though I don't feel like the horror elements in it, especially in the original, were quite as heavy as some of the other games that ended up making this list. It's still a great game, and I love Parasite Eve, as well as I actually really do enjoy Parasite Eve 2, though I know it gets a lot of flack. It actually is more survival horror-esque than the original Parasite Eve. Either way, if you've never checked out either Parasite Eve 1 or Parasite Eve 2, I can definitely recommend giving them a look. The craziest game on this list, and one that I feel like a lot of people know about now because of the age of the internet, is the Japanese-only LSD. It is a dream simulator. You start up the game, you have no idea what you're going to be put into, you're put in a random scenario using kind of the same set pieces and graphics and textures, but every time you enter into this dream world, you have no idea what's going on. You kind of wander around, you may touch an object and get transported to another part. There's some great horror-esque elements of just the whole tension of what exactly is going on, and some really weird things that end up happening as you play it. While not that it's necessarily a complete horror game, this is one that's worth looking out if you're looking for something with some horror as well as just a weirdness factor to it. For this number 1 spot, I could have gone with any of the Resident Evil games for the system. Well, maybe not Gun Survivor, but Resident Evil 2 is my favorite of the franchise, as well as one of my favorite horror games ever. It introduced Claire Redfield, my favorite character of Resident Evil. It had 2 playable characters in Claire and Leon, with both having an A and B scenario, and having to play both of them in order to get the true ending to the game. It threw in some extra modes with the likes of the survival mode for Hunk, and then of course, if you were able to get really good, you unlocked the Tofu scenario, which has always been hilarious. Resident Evil 2 had some of the most iconic bosses and set pieces, especially the Raccoon City Police Department and the final forms of William Birkin. Everything about Resident Evil 2 is just so fantastic and still stands as one of my favorite games ever made. So there you have it, the 10 best horror games of the 5th generation. Of course, this is all just my opinion, but what's your guys' opinion? What's the ones that didn't make this list you think should have, or ones that are on this list that you particularly always go back to and think fondly of when you think of horror and this generation of consoles? Be sure to check out my list I did for the 4th generation and the old school generation of gaming as well. I'll be back next week to cover the 6th generation of consoles, but with that guys, that's going to wrap up this countdown. I'd like to thank you for watching, and of course I hope you enjoy.